So you probably recognize that first reading from Zechariah chapter 9. It speaks about the messianic king arriving, bringing salvation, righteousness, and he's seated on a donkey. It also says that he's meek. The word in Hebrew is ani, which is a famous word in the scriptures referring to someone who's poor, someone who's afflicted, someone who's simple and, meek, gentle, because they have no resources and they're open to the world. Seated on a donkey. And then, of course, that is applied, as you recall, to Jesus as he enters Jerusalem at the beginning of his Passion Week. But let's really let that sink in. Here's a king, the king, Son of God, and he comes sitting on a donkey. Meek. And the first reading points out that he's come to bring peace, from peace to the ends of the earth, from the river to the ends of the earth, from the sea to the sea, from not what we call, when you hear today, from the river to the sea, that's a call to war, but he comes to bring peace to the ends of the earth, in his meekness, in his simplicity. He doesn't come on a horse, he doesn't come on a chariot, he doesn't come on a tank, he doesn't come on a chariot or a coach, he comes on a donkey. That's how Christ exercises his kingship, meek and bringing peace. How did we lose that? You know, you've seen in apses of churches around the world, there's Christos Pantocrator, the omnipotent Christ, he's up there, and very imposing. Can you imagine if we had put in all the apses of the churches throughout the world and throughout the centuries, Jesus sitting on a donkey? That might have changed our whole view. And mind you, this is how Christ behaves, but it's also how God behaves, unsurprisingly, since Jesus is the Son of God, the perfect reflection of God. God behaves with meekness, as we hear in the gospel today. You've hidden these things, I give you thanks, Father. You've hidden these things from the wise and understanding, you might say, from the powerful and the moneyed and those who have influence, and you reveal them to little ones. To little ones. And that's how God behaves in the world also. You don't see him hurling thunderbolts down like Zeus. No wrath, no anger, no cruelty, no war. Just simplicity and peace, meekness. And then follows that passage, one of the most famous passages in the whole gospel. Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and who's not, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon me and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart. This very Jesus who makes meekness one of the Beatitudes. I am gentle and meek and humble of heart. You've probably seen all sorts of icons of Jesus. Very often he's holding a script or a scroll or a book with this passage on it. That's how central it is and how consoling it is. But that meekness is what we're called to. That's why it's a beatitude. Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth. Really? They won't inherit the earth because they made war on it and conquered lands or bought them up. They will inherit the world because they are meek. In the final analysis, like Christ himself, King of the universe, in that same way. And often if you hear the word meek, you think of somebody who's not very assertive, who's a little afraid, a little snivelly, a little overwhelmed. That's not what meekness is. Meekness requires an enormous amount of spiritual and psychological maturity. not to respond or act with violence and domination and cruelty, but with patience and kindness and openness and compassion and mercy and peacemaking in the world. It requires an enormous amount of strength, an enormous amount of spiritual vision and maturity, an enormous amount of living by the Spirit of Christ. And that's the way we should understand the second reading today, when Paul is speaking about living either by the flesh or the Spirit. Now let's get one thing straight first. What is the flesh he's talking about? He says at the beginning, you're not in the flesh. Well, obviously we are, if that's what he means by it, by being in the body. He says those who are not in the flesh cannot please God, he says in the preceding verse. So does that mean none of us can please God because we're all in the flesh? It's not what he means by flesh. And God knows we put way too much emphasis on bodily sins or sexual sins in our tradition. It's a way to keep people feeling ashamed and unsure of themselves and coming back to church. But it's not, as one spiritual writer says, the big hot sins that keep us from God. It's the little cold ones. It's the anger and the pride and the arrogance and the hatred. That's what keeps us from God. And then all the cruelty that comes from that. So living in the Spirit means living with meekness and openness and compassion and love and peace. A good translation, therefore, as has been proposed for flesh in St. Paul, is ego. Those who are living by egotism or in their egos cannot please God. You're not living in your ego. You're living in the Spirit of God. And the ego wants, of course, to be in control and to dominate and to be better than everybody else and to be compared, look down and take vengeance and all that nonsense. That's the flesh. But we should live it according to the Spirit, so that we are indeed spreading peace throughout the world. Beginning in our own, we'll inherit the earth of our own bodies and souls, that we are filled with peace, meekness, and love ourselves, and then can spread it to others. So that just as Jesus says, come to me all you who labor and are burdened, we can say the same, living by that same Spirit of Christ, to welcome all those who are laboring and are burdened, all those around us who are in need, all those who are without, well, as Jesus says in Matthew 25, the hungry and the thirsty and the prisoners and the sick, the immigrants, which reminds me, as we're celebrating, if we're celebrating, I guess we are, the 250th anniversary of our country, let's return to those values. Let's return to being a peacemaker in the world, being open and welcoming, treating others and all who are in need with compassion and love and patience and openness. Not waging war, not changing the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War so that we can make war and flex our muscles and say, we're great because we're making America great again with all our F-16s. No, we're making America great again by the values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for the maximum number of people, by opening our hearts in simplicity and meekness and openness and compassion and love and peacemaking to all those, to the whole world, but beginning in our own country, beginning in our own church, beginning in our own hearts, beginning in our own families. This is the Christ we are worshiping. Or better, this is the Christ we should be following, which is what he asked us to do. To live by the Spirit, to live with meekness, to be open to others, humble of heart. It requires, as I say, an enormous amount of spiritual maturity to live that way. Not just as individuals, but as groups and as communities and as nations. But that's true greatness. That's how God acts. That's who God is. That's who Christ is. We keep saying we're Christian. We keep saying we're following Christ. Well, let's do it. And not take it in a false and ultimately blasphemous way of being dominating and controlling and excluding. Come to me, come to us, all you who labor and are burdened. Kind of like what it says on the Statue of Liberty, life and liberty. So let's truly take seriously this Christ that we meet in the gospel today and in the first reading today, and live no longer by our egos and their pettiness and their narrowness and their stupidity, but live rather by the Spirit of God in its openness, its love, compassion, and peace.